Hello everyone. First of all, thank you Nina, thank you TDC for inviting me here. My talk is going to be almost the exact opposite of Karin's. Nothing's moving, there's no LSD, there's no psychedelics. It's basically just letters, Arabic letters specifically. Alright, so as I was saying, I'm going to be talking about Arabic letters. As Nina has already said, I'm a type designer, essentially type designer, and specifically focused on Arabic. I also do some lettering work and I teach. And through this talk tonight, what I'm going to try to do is to take you on my journey in type and show you my perspective on the field, of course through my experience of the last 10 years. So just to put you a bit in context, the Arabic script is a really beautiful and very diverse and very rich script. It has been developed over 1,000 years by brilliant calligraphers and brilliant minds. It spread from east to west, taking on very different forms. It actually is different than other scripts in one main thing. It was always used as the primary element of visual identity in all the cultures that adopted the script. So it took on very different forms of abstractions and sophistication and yeah, like for example here, what you see here is, this is as far as the 9th century, three pairs of styles that were created to work together, already thinking in hierarchy of display and text together. So this is from the 800 something. It took also very monumental forms and ornamental things for inscriptions on mosques or buildings. And yeah, from east to west, it was very different. Until the 15th century, where something like this came along. This is also letters. This is the only style, though, that was never meant to be read or written. We call it the square kufi. It was meant to create patterns on walls and ceilings and floors. But remember this, because it's going to come back later, it's never meant to be read or written. So I show you all of this, and I talk about all of this just to give you a very brief idea of how diverse and rich the script is as a heritage to start from and to build stuff upon. So if you look on that side, this is all the amazing, glorious heritage that we have. And unfortunately, this is what we have in terms of type. Now, I'm not saying that this is the case right now, but for sure in the last 2 decades, this has been a very popular trend of making typefaces. And I don't know if you can guess, but through all the stuff that I just showed you, these typefaces are built on this style, the only style not meant to be read or written. So we base, not me, but people base their typefaces on, and this is something I don't identify with and I don't understand. And since my beginning in type, I never understood this, and basically everything I did after that was to fight against this kind of trend. This trend, I can't say for sure, but I can assume that this trend has been adopted widely because, first of all, it's a pretty straightforward system. It's like a pixel system, which was already very advanced as a calligraphic style. But it's, in terms of type, it's very simple. It's one-to-one. The grid is there. It's all rectilinear. There are no curves. It's just there. So basically, you maybe make it a bit lighter. You round a few corners, and that's it. You end up with several typefaces that, to me, don't look Arabic at all. They almost look Latin because the contrast applied to them is typically Latin without any meaning, basically, with just weird forms. Now, this phenomenon is not necessarily isolated from what's happening around type. It's also a product of culture, and it always changes with the context itself. So this, I can't go into a lot of details here because this is a whole other topic, but this trend came within a context of westernization as a whole in the Arab world. This is from the Gulf, especially from Dubai, that looks very Western to me. So this trend is still quite alive and well nowadays. This is in Dubai, for example. And yeah, so when I moved to, is it happening? Why did we? Okay, so when I moved to Typemedia, or to the Netherlands in 2009 to study Typemedia, making typefaces, I learned a very important lesson, 2 actually. The 2 most important lessons that I learned from Typemedia is that first, type has its roots in writing, and 2, which comes from here as well. This is the famous cube created by Nordzai, the godfather of the program, where he turns the characteristics of the script into parameters, into parametric scales, where those characteristics can create a design space, and you can roam around freely in and around these parametric scales, basically, and create your own thing. This concept is pushed further with this type hooker method, where all the characteristics of the Latin script are divided into scales, and then you can position yourself anywhere you want on the scale and end up with a new recipe for a new typeface and draw something completely different. Now, obviously, this is for Latin. When I was there, and we were asked to work on our final project, I wanted to work on an Arabic typeface. Given what I just showed you with the horrible stuff that we have, I wanted, in my own way, to counteract that. Now, I'm not saying I was the only one, of course, but this is my path in this. So in that, I chose to go for the most unlikely calligraphic style, which is an Ottoman style with a very dramatic forms and connecting lines and so on. And the thing that I wanted to focus mostly on is a characteristic that is very much for the Arabic script, and you wouldn't find it in Latin, which is this slant that you see. So this slant is the connecting line of the letters. In Arabic, most letters are connected, and instead of connecting on one horizontal line, they connect in a descending line. At the time, this was a big feature to try to achieve with type. I had never seen something like this, especially in a very typographic context, not in a context where we're trying to imitate the script. So for that, I said, okay, I'm going to forget everything that happened in printing and simplified Arabic and this horrible trend and go back to the script and start from there. And this is how Thureya came to be. I went to Lebanon, I studied with a calligrapher for about 2-3 weeks. I didn't study how to write the script, I studied how to analyze it, how to look at it, how to try to fish out all the characteristics of the script that I will later on employ as scales or parametric scales in my own typeface. Of course, I did the mistake that you would expect from me at that time. It was my first typeface and I didn't know what I was doing, so I started by imitating the script as a beginning, and that did not work at all. What you see here is actually the later stage of it, when I devised a slant that is a typographic parameter as opposed to a calligraphic one, that has its own rules and it functions independently from the script. But of course, it has its roots in the script, so this idea of slant comes from there. And of course, it's a lot of fun typing slanted. Maybe you should try from it. So this is how it works. This is the slanted version. Then I made also a regular horizontal version, which looks like this. So this is how you can compare them. At the time, this was a very important feature. Nowadays, it's very easy to do something like this with something called cursive attachment. At the time, we had to contact Adobe, and my teacher, Eric van Doppelen, at the time, wrote the script to make this work. So because I wanted to do something very fluid and very organic, I had to design all these crazy ligatures, and I ended up with a huge character set. And this was my first typeface, and already at that moment, the idea of complexity started showing up in my work, which we'll see later. After graduating, I started working with Peter Bidak from Typographic. He had his own foundry, and he was interested to start releasing some Arabic typefaces. So he asked me to design first Greta Text Arabic and then Greta Sans Arabic. And even something as simple as that, as basic as that, when I was about to start working on it, I had no idea how to approach it, because we don't have any theories, we don't have books, we don't have researches, we have very, very little resources when it comes to Arabic type. So even with something as basic as contrast, we don't know what to do, how to behave. It has to be your own personal interpretation of the letter form. And if you can see from this drawing here, the contrast in Arabic is no easy thing. It changes all the time. The angle of the pen changes all the time. They use the tip of the pen sometimes. They rotate the pen sometimes. So it's a lot of work to just figure out what is the contrast. But this project was all about this. So basically, from here on, after the slant that I showed you in the first project, I'm going to show you some characteristics of the Arabic script that I tried to bring back into type, one project at a time. So even something like, how would you deal with a high contrast typeface and a low contrast typeface? How would you move from a high contrast to a low contrast? had to be something I had to figure out for myself. Or how to remove the influence of the pen, for example, from the letter forms, and what does that mean, or how does it affect the letter form. So the second part of Greta, which is the sans, or the Arabic for the sans, it turned out eventually as a type system of 39 fonts. And here, another layer of complication, or another characteristic that I had to deal with, was the width. Again, there was no references whatsoever, no typefaces whatsoever that would compress Arabic this way or extend it this way. So I had to figure it out myself. How would you compress the counterforms of Arabic that look nothing like the counterforms of Latin? In Latin, you already have a lot of steps or procedure. You know how to go through it. In Arabic, I had to start, figuring it out myself. Even something as basic as weight, for example. You know, or people who work with type know that in Latin, when a typeface grows in weight, it grows in width as well. Whereas in Arabic, because it has a very different stress, the letters grow mostly vertically. So they start looking like bigger letters, not just darker letters. And that was also a balance that I needed to figure out by myself. This is eventually how it ended up looking like, with all the width and weights combined. And this is how you can compare them next to each other, the high contrast version versus the low contrast version. So these two projects were the foundation of the type foundry that I started later with Peter, which is Typographic Arabic. And this is our first type specimen, which is at the moment being printed. I wished I could have brought some with me, but I couldn't. So even in the specimen, by the way, I revisited the old manuscripts and tried to create this modern or contemporary interpretation of what illumination around the manuscript would look like, and this is what I ended up with. Another parameter I'll talk about is when I was asked to design the typeface of the Louvre Abu Dhabi. The signage of this museum is always trilingual, and the Arabic is always on top, and Arabic by nature is always smaller than French or English. And it needed to have a bit more importance because it's located in the Arab world and so on. So I suggested the idea to go back to this feature of the Arabic script, which is what you see marked in white. This is a feature that we call med, or extending, or extending any connections of two letters. This is normally used for justification of text. And the cool thing about this is that you really can extend these connections as much as you want, 1.5 meters long, it would still be readable and everything's fine. So I thought, okay, normally this from the script has been turned into type to this one line of just stroke, straight stroke. And that is also fine, we can use it in some places, but in this case I wanted something more organic to go with the whole feel of the typeface. And so I suggested, okay, let's add this kind of organic extensions to the letter forms. And this, even though it's a tiny detail, it really gave the Arabic a lot more importance and did the job, basically. So I used this feature from the script for a need very much that is coming from our day now. It's not something in the past. And this is how eventually it looked like in the signage of the museum. And again, because I wanted to do all of this, I ended up with a quite complex character set. So this is a thing. This is a recurrent thing in my work. And so this is the whole character set of the Louvre Abu Dhabi typeface. The last two typefaces I'll talk about are together, and I will talk about them quite briefly because they are in process. The first one, you remember in the beginning I showed you all these crazy calligraphic styles in Arabic. The good news is that all of these can be grouped into two categories. I call them solid and fluid. It's a term that I started using with my friend Lara Kaplan, who I'll talk about in a bit. Solid and fluid. What my aim is with these two type systems, two humongous type systems, this one is 13 or 11 families, and this one is going to be 9 families. My aim is to basically explore most of the important fluid styles in that one, in Mizan, and most of the important solid styles in Kandus. So Mizan is a type system that basically studies the hierarchy of text, or of information in text, and whole layout. And it compares between the method employed in manuscripts in Arabic, which is a completely different method than what happened later in printing, when you do a style that is made for headline or for text or so on. So this type system will compare both in all options and see what's going to happen. And the Conduce type system is as you see here, is not complete. It's going to have 3 more. You can't see the ones yeah, well, there's something that you can't see. So this type system is supposed to study the development of all the fluid styles, from all the solid styles, sorry, from their most solid form into a bit more fluid form. This is how what you see in black here in Mizan is this one. This is the only family that is released so far of this type system. The rest will be maybe in the next decade or something, I don't know. And then Conduce, on the other hand, is a typeface that started as an homage to this crazy person. This is a calligrapher from the 19th century called something something El-Condusi. So the name is even an homage to him. Maybe he was on LSD, I don't know. But there's something here that, I mean, it's not usual at all, his work. It's very, very peculiar, and it's very well known as his work. No one has produced forms like this. And I was really intrigued by his work, so I wanted to basically, I started by designing something that can show the textures of his work, but then it grew much bigger. Like most of the stuff I do, they start small and get bigger. And it became a much larger type system about the whole development of all the solid styles. At the moment, it looks like this. These are 3 out of 9 styles. And that's it for the typefaces.
Wow.
So the second thing I'm going to show you is the lettering, my lettering work. So remember I was talking about the complexity and so on. Here is where it shows really quickly. I do lettering to break away from type, which is not that far away, but it's as far as I can get for the moment. So it's still dealing with letters, with Arabic letters. And so whether it's something I do, these are all doodle. This is a series of doodles that I would do like after midnight. So even if it's by hand or something, there's always something that attracts me in complexity of forms. Here I'm showing 2 posters. This is the most recent one on the right side. It's basically my ideals in life. It says love, freedom, beauty, and truth. And this one came out of a frustration about Beirut and the traffic in Beirut. So there's the word Beirut very deep down in the traffic. And then the traffic lights are the dots of the word Beirut. There's 2 more. This one is, basically this is a contemporary interpretation of the old calligraphers' sheets. They used to do this kind of exercises so that they can measure the letters and practice and so on. And by the way, from this poster, I brought a few. They are on this table here. Please feel free to get your own copy when we're done. And on this side, this is an illustrated quote. These are all letters. And this poster basically, it's a quote that says, let me see if I can, no, I can't read it from here, but it basically compares the different behavior of letters in language and in the script. So that's what it is. Still within the lettering realm, a few years ago, we started, me, Khajak Apelgan, and Wael Marcus was here now, we started this Arabic lettering series. It's a series of workshops that takes on a different theme every time. We do a new episode, and the next episode is going to be the Saturday one here at TDC. And basically, we again go through the same methodology that I showed you before, where we dissect the script into characteristics that we can play around with and generate new forms. And every episode is a different theme, and we guide the participants to be able to create their own lettering piece that would reflect the theme. And once more. And the last thing is teaching. So I said type, lettering, and teaching, and this is teaching. This is probably the furthest away, but still around type. So basically, a few years ago, I met a fantastic woman by the name of Lara Kaptan. She's also a type designer, Arabic type designer based in Amsterdam, struggling like me to make sense of things. And so at some point we pulled our efforts together and we started thinking together about things. And we developed each other's methodology even further. It goes back to the same thing that I talked about, dissecting the script into parameters and so on. But we created a stronger list of parameters, a more analytical list. And because of that, we decided to start what is this, the Arabic Type Design in Beirut, which is the first and only program totally dedicated to Arabic type design. It's only 6 weeks, not a full year program, but that's the most we could do at the moment. And it follows the exact same methodology. And after we did it already 2 times, and the 3rd time is happening soon. And I'm really happy to see the results. This was the results of only the first year. We had 22 students, and they ended up with typefaces. This is 1 letter from each typeface. And they ended up doing some things that are very rich, very diverse, very Arabic, very representative of this methodology. So it kind of worked, and that's really cool. This is also another set of examples of their work. They all look very different. Nothing is similar to the other one. I'm sure you can tell. All this methodology, everything I spoke about, all my life experience basically, or career experience, led me and Lara to this. We wrote a manifesto that is called Arabic Script to Type. A manifesto, it's our first version yet. It might be edited later. It's available on my Foundry's website with this link. You can, if you want to know more, or you didn't remember anything I said tonight, you can read that and it will still tell you very similar stuff. I'm gonna conclude, before saying thank you, I'm gonna conclude on a positive note. A lot of what I showed you happened 10 years ago. Since then, there's a rising generation of designers that are actually working on finding alternatives to this horrible trend. One of them is also Wael, who's here. And there's really quite a generation that is doing its work now, and this is very positive. We are in a good place now, and hopefully it will keep getting better. Thank you.
So I have like about 17 follow-up questions, but I think they're too specific. So let me, I hope we'll get there eventually, but let me open it up again to the wide view, which is that the reason that we're lucky enough to have both of you here on stage is that you're in town to serve as jurors for the TDC communication design and type design competitions, respectively. Which of course we're super happy to have you. So one thing we were hoping to chat a little about is this whole question of judging design, judging creative work. For one thing, there's this common misconception among, I guess, mostly lay people that this is all subjective anyway, so what do you look at? How do you counter that? How do you shoot that down?
Well, I do think my category is actually communication. So there is that criteria of trying to, on or no?
I think if you hold it a little
Okay.
closer.
Right here? That's better. I think there's the criteria that whatever the piece is communicating something, whether it's an emotion, a piece of information, a new idea, and it could be something very small too, just to delight. But I think there is, I look at work to see that it's communicating some sort of goal. And I think that is, it is all subjective, but it's not, there is criteria. And so that's what makes a judging process, I think, valid.
Well, in type, it might be a bit more difficult to judge it based on the same criteria. But for me, 2 things are very important. Is basically, did it do what it set out to do, the typeface? So if the designer has a concept in mind, and it's important that they have a concept for me, if it does this concept, this is very important, first of all. And second, of course, it's type. It has to be well drawn. It cannot be not well drawn. So those 2 criteria are very important for me.
Yeah, I think craftsmanship should never be overlooked. And it's funny because I work in motion, and I always say to students, or to anybody really, like, if it doesn't look good still, it won't look good moving. And it's a adage I just sort of take to heart because it's so many times I see, work that because somebody thought it was moving fast or moving to music or blurred or has motion blur, that doesn't need to be good type, which is not true. So I think looking at that with an eye towards craftsmanship, like the same standards that you would apply to a poster, to a book, to a piece of type that you would find, that you would invest in the printing of, that you take the criteria and also apply it to the screen is something I look at.
Well, when it comes to Arabic type, there's something important. I believe that what we're doing now, everyone, is quite experimental. We are trying stuff. And I would like to see some experimentation happening in the work submitted.
In Latin type as well.
Well, I mean, yeah, of course. It's something, I mean, whether it's Arabic or Latin, to me, experimenting with the letter forms for a very specific concept or need or a specific characteristic of the script that you want to try something with, this is very important in any script.
Well, so since we're still talking about competitions, and you're talking about communication design and how communicating matters, and you talked a little bit about, I think with type, communication doesn't matter so much, right? Because it's different. You're not needing to think about the concept behind it. Like as designers, as communication designers, we have to take typefaces and then do something with it. And so Nina and I were talking about that a little bit from our perspectives of typeface designer and communication designer, and debating that. And Nina, did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think they touched on exactly that point, because we were wondering, like, are the criteria necessarily different? Because if you're talking about communication design, it's actually exactly what you said, Karin. It's like you have a story, you have something that needs to be communicated. And one thing that I, as a type designer, sometimes find challenging is that in type, normally you don't know what the content's going to be. You don't know what this thing is going to communicate to whom. You're basically making a vessel for content, but without knowing what that content is. Unless maybe if you're making like a custom thing for a client where you know exactly what the use is going to be. Do you find that difficult, or is it just different?
Well, to be honest, for me, typefaces also have stories. They also have a certain concept. I mean, at least the stuff that I do, or the typefaces that I work on, I always try to set a story behind this typeface. Of course, that doesn't mean that it's going to carry a certain type of content with it, but for me, the forms that I draw, they carry a story within, and that's important for me to see as well in other people's
So
work.
then what happens when somebody takes the typeface and does something different with it?
There's nothing I can do.
How do you
It's
feel
just
about
out
that?
there in the world. It's not, but the story of, or the concept of a typeface doesn't necessarily dictate what content it should carry. It's more about how the forms are presented, or yeah.
So I have a question for both of you. Being judges of competition, and Karin, you start tomorrow. Do competitions matter? Do design competitions matter? Do awards competitions matter? And how so?
I think they've shifted a little bit in the last decade or so of, being able, it used to be that it would be the place you would see the work. And I think with the web, our distribution models have changed. But I do think that they're important mostly into having a conversation of what makes the culture of your craft or how it can be influential. I think it's a great place. It's like it's a gathering place of all of the year's work. And as a survey, you can see directions that the industry and our craft is going. And I think it's important in that to take a critical view, to take a look. I think, it used to be a lot of that, plus the idea that's how the work had a primary distribution. I think now actually it's shifted to be a little bit more of more questions of what is the, how's, the media landscape's changing so fast. How do we how is our craft changing with it? What are we doing to forward the art of it? Those are kind of bigger questions, which are actually more exciting than like, well, what's new in book covers, like this year, which it still does. But, we all know we don't have to see the work that way in annuals anymore. So it's, I think, tackling a little bit more interesting questions, actually.
Well, I'm going to say very similar stuff to what Karin said. I will add just one thing that I think they matter even more for younger designers and potentially students as well. It's good to have your work being assessed by professionals in the field, and if you win, it's good to have your work out there as well. So yeah, they do matter in a lot of ways. I would think that they would matter less and less as you get more experience in your career. But for younger designers, I think it's an important thing, yeah.
So I'm going to try very hard not to ask what's new in book covers this year, but what is this moment for you? Is it a good moment for type? Is it a good moment for typography? Is it, I know we all are talking about how quickly things are changing and moving, but how do you feel about being in your discipline at this moment?
I think it's incredibly exciting right now. We're doing a lot of work. In just a very short amount of time, texting has become like a primary mode of communication, and it's all typography, right? And it's all, texting over photos, texting, not just texting, but we expect to see text in our imagery that we send to each other, in our videos. That wasn't the case. It's harder, because it's so natural to us now. It wasn't the case like 10 years ago even. And it's just at the beginning right now. It's like the beginning of cinema or any other kind of new communication. What's that going to be? What's that going to look like when the tools of texting or the tools of typography catch up to what we can do and send to each other on our phones or not on our phones or whatever delivery systems, or we laugh at Google Glass or what it was, but those kind of things are going to develop, and they're going to have text, they're going to have typography, where everybody is now well versed in that you can express yourself with typography. That wasn't the case when I was a kid. That wasn't, I had a calligraphy, I had a calligraphy set, but I was a geek, but now everybody expresses themselves in typography. So I think it's a really interesting time, and it's a really fertile time for us.
Yeah, well, as I said in the last part of the talk also actually, is that in Arabic type, it's also a very exciting time. We still have challenges, of course, like every other field. The main challenge is now in Arabic, the actual perception of what modern type is in the Arab world or in the Gulf, as I showed you. They do perceive what I showed you, this horrible trend, as modern Arabic. So there's still a lot of work to be done. But on the other hand, there's also, as I said, a rising generation of designers that are actually doing some really nice alternatives for this trend, and it looks very promising. Yeah.
Well, I have a question I think everybody's really been wanting to know, Karin. So where do you keep your Emmys? Do you have a shelf for them? Do you have like a special case? Is it dust proof?
My first one's on my mother's piano next to my high school graduation picture.
Amazing.
And I haven't decided the second one. I was going to bring it into the studio actually, but my kids wanted to look at it longer, so it's sitting at home, but I have to find a home for it. Yeah.
What was your acceptance speech like for the Emmys? Was there like a big, I saw the picture. What was that event and that night like?
It's incredible. I had the benefit of 17 years ago, 17 years ago, going up. And I just remember from that night, there was a big clock. And it was counting down, you should have one for these talks, right? No, and if I didn't get off the stage, the music starts. So I just remember being like that at the talk, like that clock. And when I went up just in September for the second one, after 17 years, there wasn't the clock, but I remember that feeling of I have to thank everybody, but it's great. It's a complete rush. I've been there when I haven't won, and it's still fun, but it's more fun when you win.
I have a follow-up question to you, Kristyan, which I've been wondering about, especially also now hearing you speak about your work. So you work. Okay, let me loop around. For me, as a designer who makes Latin type and is in New York, one of the interesting things and sort of side aspects of doing type design is that when I go out my door, type is everywhere. When I don't go out the door, type is also everywhere. So you're kind of constantly immersed in that. And I was wondering, so you work in Arabic, but you spent most of your time in Amsterdam. So the visual sort of input you get is actually in a different script, and it is in the very script whose influence on your script you're kind of trying to push back against. Is that weird? Does it make it more difficult, or does it actually help in some kind of weird way?
I don't go out. No, well, to be honest, if I would go out in Lebanon on the street and so on, I'm gonna see stuff that I don't like more than stuff that I like. So, to me, all the inspiration comes from the script itself. And luckily, there's a lot of books, a lot of compendiums, a lot of different resources for the script, for calligraphy, but not for type.
So are you fundamentally never inspired by things that you find bad?
That's a tough one. Well, maybe sometimes I would be inspired to do it better or to change it or something. but so far, I mean, at this point in time, my main inspiration still comes from the beauty of the script and the complexity of the script.
Because I was just wondering, like, I often find myself fascinated by lettering that's kind of bad or old or like not entirely competently executed or falling apart. And I'm wondering if that's kind of a privileged perspective because, we have so much type in Latin that we can even start making it bad on purpose.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is a bit, because finding a bad lettering in Arabic is not a special thing at all. It's everywhere. So it's just bad, and yeah, that doesn't necessarily attract me, no.
So I have one last question, and then I'm from the audience. But so at TDC we have this idea, as you can see with the conference, of type drives culture. So it kind of really means that type drives, kind of shapes language, and it imparts meaning and reflects values. And so it's a question for both of you. Like, what does type do in your worlds that kind of affects culture in a really tangible way? So can you, especially like you working out of Los Angeles and working within the kind of really cultural, pop culture capital of the world. Can you talk a little bit about that? And Kristyan also.
Well, I think type is incredibly important in setting what is probably one of the most important things that we work on is setting tone and setting and giving, and when used correctly, bringing some emotional currency to the projects. It also has the power, and this is very important for a lot of the kind of pop culture that we're involved in, is the power to make something iconic, memorable, stick with you as an icon. I think an excellent example of that is the Stranger Things title that my colleague Michelle Doherty designed, which has taken a life of its own. It's become its own cultural phenomena. People do their own versions. There's, and it's a way of connecting with something bigger. Right, the show, it's a way that people keep it in their lives, and this icon that's shorthand for this whole world. And so much of the world that I'm in is about world building and having these fictional worlds. And, type, honestly, I think is an underused tool, but is a very powerful tool. If you think about so many of the, this entertainment and the stories we love, think of that. The iconic nature of the Star Wars type, or how they open with that scroll of type. I could go on with, I could do a whole lecture about the other kind of examples, but I think it's a testament to the power, excuse me, the power of typography, and when used correctly. And, the thing is that the thing it's attached to has to be good, has to have, it won't save a story, it won't make an edit better, it doesn't make a song sound better, but when it's used as part of the whole, it's incredibly powerful.
Well, as I said in the beginning of my talk, the script, the Arabic script, has a very, very important relevance in the culture as a whole. It was used as the primary component of visual identity. So it was always there on buildings, in books, in scientific books, and it's always there. And I couldn't say that now it's the same, it has the same importance, probably because the whole culture is struggling in some ways. But I can say that I hope we go back to a day where it has even more importance. Because really, at the end of the day, either for type designer or for the person using the typeface is a certain expression tool, basically. So when I design typefaces, I'm also expressing parts of myself through these drawings, and when people use it, they're also expressing something with it. So I do hope that we will go back to this importance for type.
So we have just a couple minutes, but if you have any questions, someone have something to ask over here?
Yeah, question for, there it goes.
Question for Kristyan. It was a small part of your talk, but the work you did for the museum that you mentioned, I thought it felt really consequential, because you started your talk saying that you were trying to escape from this style that was designed for architecture, that was just never designed to be read, and now you've done that, and then now it's part of the architecture of a museum. And so I'm just curious if the work for that wayfinding project, if you had to change the type just to physically make it work in that mounting system at all, or if there were any rules you had to come up with so that it would...
No, but I'm not sure I got the comparison between what I talked about was a different style that I never worked on.
I think I understand, but I guess I just thought it was neat that that's an architectural style, as I understand it. It's used in mosaics. Mm-hmm. And now you're using your attempt to get away from that in architecture for a museum wayfinding.
Yeah, although it's for different reasons. This is for signage. What I did is for signage. It's not for beautiful inscriptions on the wall that are just there to be visual. You know what I mean? What I designed is to guide people, is to be read and understood very clearly. So yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm still curious, just the physical act of having to make that type work in a physical, tangible sign. Did you have to come up with any system so that it would work physically mounted?
Well, physically, there had some issues with the lighting, and because some of these letters had light inside of them, and in certain thicknesses, you can't put the light inside, so it has to be, we had to deal with some stroke endings and make sure that they are not below a certain thickness and so on. But yeah, not much more than this.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Yep, I'm running. Hi. Lately, I've been very interested in both animation and custom type, so I'm very excited to be here. I was wondering if you guys see the relationship between the two changing over time. Like, will there ever be a time where type will be designed to be animated, or will it always be like motion applied to type that has already been designed and thought about beforehand?
That's a really interesting question, and I think that is a ripe field for exploration. As we get more technology, I could totally see a typeface designed expressively for on-screen use that has motion, that might change quality with motion. I think it's a little out there and experimental, but I think I could see that. There's so much, questions about what does type look like in AR or VR. Even since my career, 3D tools have increased so much in the sophistication that the way we can almost make architectural forms with type is just this more facile, and so I can totally imagine a scenario like that.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for the talks, and looking forward to judging with you guys for the next few days.
Awesome.
My question is mostly for Karin. because I make a lot of motion type as well, and time is really important when it comes to motion, and especially for things that when you're working on a title sequence, you want people to read, but meanwhile you want to challenge for it to be expressive and have fun and stuff. Like, what is your general rule of thumb or your general take on the legibility and the readability when motion is applied? And because I like to make things that nobody can fucking read, but that clearly happens to be a problem to some people. So
I mean, what are they? I mean, come on. There's clearly, as we learned, whole type systems that are not supposed to be read. I mean, can people, be a little bit more modern about this? Yeah. That's a good question, and I guess it goes back to what you want to communicate. So there's many different problems in typography on screen, or challenges. It's so funny, we're talking about what I should talk about in this talk, and there's something I called like the karaoke effect, or the being driven by karaoke. And there are whole pieces, I don't think I showed one, but the Rolling Stone one came the closest, where you're meant to read something, a text on screen. And it's your job as a typographer making this animation to drive the read. And for me, sometimes what I even do is I'll record somebody so I get the natural cadence of a human voice, and then animate it to the voice. Because you'll find if you just animate, sometimes it'll be visually there, but you won't hear it as a type voice. But when you do a title, so there's something like that. So you do, you see many commercials with text that do that, or like that. So you have to kind of track it. But with the title, you don't really have to for instance, that piece of communication is a little different, right? It's about this overall tone. You absolutely have to make the names legible. It's kind of funny. I once did a title with Harold Ramis, and he's great, good humored guy, bless him. And at the time, it was a movie title. It's for a movie called Bedazzled, and it was a feature film. And at the time, we always would make our titles as small as we could possibly get away with, because God forbid if you made them too large, it would look like television, and that would be the worst thing in the world. The way you would always get away when somebody's like, "Can you make the type bigger?" You'd be like, "Yeah, but it would look like TV," and which was an insult in those days, and now it's totally flipped, right? Because TV's the greatest thing in the world. And he just looked at me and goes, "Karin, people have to read their names." I was like, "Oh, Harold Ramis, he's right." So there's you have to have it so people, and there are my rule is that you have to read it out loud twice or something like that. Maybe once, but you have to be able to read it out loud. But as far as the title sequence goes, typographically, it's not a narrative. It's not a type narrative per se. So my rules are different, right? It's about more of a rhythm, and actually I think most title sequences look better with the type than without type, but I'm a typographer, so I'm biased. But I don't know if that's, and then there's some, I love pieces where it's just type as image, abstract. We were trying to do a little bit of that with the breakthrough, but even there's ones that just push it even more, where it just becomes form, like some of your calligraphers, where it becomes, I'm sure it's readable, but it really is the assault of form.
Yeah, of course, a lot of it is not.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. And speaking of that, I have made a faux pas. Now I know, I did a concept. It wasn't chosen but for something that dealt with the Arabic world, and I used that, and I used the unreadable style. But now I'm educated. I'm woke on that. It was to make it 3D into a building. At the end, it paid off. But anyway. Now I know. Now I know. Not Ghostbusters.
Kristyan.
Yes?
We have a
I don't
Did
have
you
any-
want to say something?
No.
No?
There was no question.
Another question?
So I have a question for Kristyan. So as I understand, the Arabic language has a lot of different dialects. And my question is if the dialects are incorporated in the different scripts, and if yes, how do you work with that, or do you even work with that, or do you just concentrate on the Lebanese dialect?
Well, Unfortunately, the dialects are never written. It's very rare instances where people write the dialect. So when you deal with type, you deal with the Arabic written language, which is a common one across all the Arab world. I'm one of the advocates that we should start writing our dialects because people are having less and less of relationship with the script. So, but yeah, at the moment, we don't have to deal with this because they are never written.
I have a little follow-up to that. Is there like Arabic slang that you design? Is that part of it? Like how we would have, you know, I don't know, not emojis, but, you know, something that's kind of incorporated that way?
Well, I mean, there's of course Arabic slang, and it depends on the different dialects. It can change dramatically. And for example, I would never understand the slang of Moroccans. It's just completely different. But I have not worked with anything related to that personally.
Question for Kristyan. To follow up on Nina's question, she said bad type, but I also find this type really appealing as well. I would refer to it as vernacular, meaning more idiosyncratic, personal expression perhaps. And so when you see a hand-painted sign, for instance, Arabic script written by hand, is it all the stuff that influences you by master penman, or do weird little homemade signs enter into it? Because I think sometimes that brings out certain particular qualities and personality. Is that of interest?
Well, of course, not necessarily it always has to be, you know, amazing penmanship or something. It can be rough vernacular work on the street that could be inspirational. But yeah, I'm just saying it's not as special to have bad lettering on the streets in let's say in Lebanon.
When it's wrong, does it influence you to say, I know that's not right, but there's something interesting about how that
I always get the itch to fix it, to do something about it. I do that. So yeah, but not, I mean, to be honest, for the last maybe year or two, I've been focused a lot on doing things, so I'm not looking for inspiration. So I'm trying to block things out. I need to finish stuff. I mean, I showed you 2 type systems that will never be done if I don't work, so yeah, but normally, of course, they can also be of inspiration, yeah.
The one that you ended up doing, the kind of big, the big fat, the fatter type, the bolder, kind of almost, I would like black, extra black, one at the end. Would that be considered more vernacular? Because you said the person from centuries ago that did it in a way that was almost illegible and it looks unlike anything anybody else had ever done. So you chose to now make your own version of that.
Well, the thing is, he didn't do something illegible. It's perfectly
not illegible. Okay.
Yeah, it's perfectly legible. Basically, it's a very simple thing. What he did is he used thicker pens to write a style that is supposed to be written with a thin pen. That's all. This is the premise of what he did.
It's like writing with a Sharpie?
What is a Sharpie? What is a Sharpie? Well, yeah, something like this, actually, yeah. But he took it to an extreme where new forms were being generated because this style is meant to be written by this specific pen.
One last one. I'll run this one.
Hi, thanks. Hi, thank you both for your presentations. I have a question for Karin. Mine was just in reference to like working with archives, how that process works with you and your team in developing, like before the project even begins, whether you have access to archives or are there certain resources that you go to sort of build inspiration from?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question that, you know, the research is one of my favorite parts of the job, and whatever that entails, like looking into a certain artist or a certain science or time period, like just getting all that knowledge. If it's in the case of a documentary, like let's say where we worked with Jigsaw Productions on the Ken Kesey film or the Rolling Stone, when they already had existing deals with like Rolling Stone magazine that we could, you know, that they could pull things from their archives. They got us books and everything from the from the from Ken Kesey's work, and actually had the access to the sound recording of him going on this trip that they had no visuals to. So actually the design project came from the access to the archive. You know, they realized they had no visuals for him tripping out on tape, and so that became our project. But it can vary as much to, you know, sometimes, so that's those are specific documentary cases, and when you're working very close with filmmakers who have been trying to get deals and get the rights to the work and everything. For something like the Herman Miller piece at the end, which it was fantastic, Herman Miller, some corporations, that's not true. Most corporations don't. They're like, what? Our logo? Get off the website. No, but like, you all have that, or we'll send it to you in a week. You're like, what? Do you have the AI file? What? But like, no, but Herman Miller had, at least when I worked with them, had a wonderful archive that actually had a full-time archivist there who could pull out blueprints of the original Eames chairs and even like the contracts and letters from George Nelson about the royalties. And I remember he had a white coat and a little pen, and he'd come out and like you'd say like, do you have the blue, you know, he'd like go in the back, and there'd be like the original direct mailers and all these things that, and like, you know, I said, can I see the, you know, the Herman Miller logo from a year, you know, the 1974, whatever, and they would have all the iterations of the logo. You know, so that was a very special design-driven corporation, but that required a special trip there. Grant Lau and I went to the archives, took pictures, took slides, ordered things, and that really makes the piece, right? Because having all that like primary source material, it was really crucial. For a lot of other things, though, you're looking at the archives, and then often you have to recreate things. Like for I'm Dying Up Here, we didn't have the rights to any of that LA Reader paper. So all that we subsequently make our own versions. We did Mad Men as well. We researched a lot of ads, but we ultimately had to remake those period ads because, you know, it's not like you can just take an old Life magazine and get the Chevrolet ad out. So and have the rights to it. So yes. Absolutely deep diving into the research. It's different every time about who owns the rights, but it's an incredibly important part of the whole design process.
Great. All right. Well, this has been one fantastic night. So thank you everyone for coming out. Let's thank our presenters one last time.